You can't fight racism against Jews by promoting racism against Palestinians. It doesn't work that way. If you are anti-racist, you believe in the dignity, security, and rights of all people, and you can't sacrifice one for another.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumud. All about humanity, so this right here for everyone. Uplift, amplify, empower everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumud.
Visit sumudpod.com to subscribe and connect with us on social media. Consider supporting our work through a contribution on the Support Us page. For nearly 2 months, Israel has blocked humanitarian aid trucks from entering Gaza, but the need for care hasn't stopped. UNRWA's mental health counselors are still there, supporting kids through trauma every single day. That's Sumud. On Saturday, May 31st, walk or run with Ed and the Sumud Podcast team at the Gaza 5K, an UNRWA USA fundraiser for refugee mental health, either in person at Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C., or virtually from anywhere. Sign up at gaza5k.org and use the code SUMUD, S-U-M-U-D, at checkout for $10 off.
On this episode of the Sumud Podcast, we uplift, empower, and amplify Nora Lester Murad. Nora is a writer, educator, and activist. Her journey has taken her from Pasadena, California, to Jerusalem, Palestine, from academia to village meetings, from protest lines to children's books. Through it all, she is driven by justice and remains a member of the Palestinian community, by marriage, by motherhood, and by choice. Dr. Murad, welcome.
Thank you so much. I don't usually use Dr. Murad. I'm kind of trying to decolonize my name, you know.
I hear you. I was going to ask you for permission to call you Nora, so I do appreciate that.
Please.
So I want to open with something I thought was powerful. You had stated, I believe it was on your blog, that you are a member of the Palestinian community by marriage, by motherhood, and by choice, and that it is an identity you wear with humility and pride. What does by choice mean?
Well, I guess I feel influenced by the way Indigenous people have talked about what it means to be Indigenous, that it's not just a matter of blood or of heritage, but also a choice that you make about how to affiliate your concerns, your time, where your skin is in the game. So while I'm not Palestinian, and I never pretend to be, and I use my full name, Nora Lester Murad, in order to not misrepresent myself as Palestinian, I do feel that my life, my happiness, my future, my past is all wrapped up with Palestinians. And so for that reason, I consider myself a non-Palestinian member of the Palestinian community. And so far, no Palestinians have told me they don't want me. On the contrary, I've felt incredibly welcomed and included and appreciated.
That's wonderful. So how does one go from Pasadena to essentially being Palestinian?
Certainly growing up, I never heard of Palestinians, nor did I know anything about Palestine. I am Jewish and I had heard of Israel, but I didn't know anything about, the Nakba or occupation, nor was my family Zionist. My family was very intentionally anti-racist, very political. My parents were super involved in desegregation and supporting undocumented people and just in general, committed to social justice. So in a way, it was a straight line from growing up, learning about what's happening in the Middle East, understanding my complicity as a Jew and as a US taxpayer, and then getting more involved. In another way, it was a very serendipitous kind of journey. I was actually at UCLA. I was a student activist working on divestment from apartheid South Africa. That's how old I am. So we were trying to divest UCLA from apartheid South Africa. And something related to my personality, I felt like I had to go see it for myself. There were people saying this and people saying that, and I wasn't really sure what to believe. I wanted to see it for myself. I was in Europe, kind of backpacking as some kids do. This was in my second year of college, and I decided that I would go to South Africa. But my French host family thought that was not safe. So they bought me a non-refundable ticket to Israel because somehow they thought that was a better place for me to go. I was like, okay, it's non-refundable. So there's nothing I can do. I got to go. And I went to this place not knowing anything about it. I stayed for 6 weeks. It was a very intense experience on a million levels. I met people that impacted me. I was terribly sexually harassed for the entire time. I saw beautiful places. I learned that there was some kind of a problem or a conflict or an issue. And I learned about it in very indirect ways. I'd say, oh, I'm going to Bethlehem today. And they'd say, oh, but there are Arabs there. And I'd be like, okay, is that bad? Because I didn't even know. I didn't even know what I was supposed to respond to that. So I became super curious and went back to UCLA, changed my major to Middle Eastern Studies, and then immediately applied to do a year abroad in Cairo, Egypt. So that's what I did. I spent my junior year abroad in Cairo and my senior year abroad, which was an unusual opportunity that I created for myself, I spent at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. I made the case that I needed to see the other side. Having lived for a year in the Arab world and traveled to Sudan and Syria and Jordan and learned Arabic, I made the case I needed to go to Israel. And in between those 2 years, I met my husband, my Palestinian Muslim husband, and that kind of, brought me into the community in a different way, as a wife, as a daughter-in-law, as a sister-in-law.
So growing up in California, this is a question I always ask to Palestinians. When's the first time you realize you're a Palestinian? To non-Palestinians, I'll ask, when's the first time you've heard of Palestine? Growing up in a Jewish household, was Palestine ever mentioned?
No, and neither was Israel. It was just not part of my growing up. Ask me about Black history, ask me about labor history, ask me about women's history, ask me about queer history. I grew up with those things, but I did not grow up with Israel. If you want a story, I sometimes talk about how non-Palestinians like me, we have our first Palestinian, someone we met first who kind of was, transformational, life-changing, made us love or be curious and get involved more. And my first Palestinian was a student at American University in Cairo named Hasan. She was Palestinian from the United Arab Emirates. And I noticed her in the dormitory in the girls' hostel. I was interested in her for whatever reason, but also shy. And she was shy and we didn't really speak. We kind of looked at each other. On the first day, I passed by her room and she was praying in the wrong direction, which I only knew that because I had seen our doorman pray. And she had just arrived from the United Arab Emirates. So I told one of the other girls, I said, I think she's praying in the wrong direction. And then they figured out that she was, and she came and said, thank you. She was so grateful. And that kind of broke the ice. And the next important conversation I remember having with her, and this was transformational, actually. I remember it now, 40 plus years later. She said to me, I feel so bad for you that you had to grow up as a woman in the United States. Like that must have been really hard. And that was confusing to me. So I was like, no, I actually really like being a woman in the United States. And she goes, why? I said, well, we have a lot of freedom. And she said, freedom to be poor, freedom to be raped, freedom to be homeless. And I was like, oh gosh, I never thought about it that way. The way that freedom comes with certain dangers and the very tight collectivist culture, Arabic culture and Palestinian culture, which takes away some freedoms, also provides some protections. So those are just a couple of stories that I remember.
That's a great story. Do you still keep in touch with this person?
I do not. I have tried to find her again after many years. Maybe she'll see this. Hasan, call me.
If any of our listeners know who Hasan is, please let her reach out to us immediately.
Yes,
Appreciate that.
yes. And when I was in Egypt, by the way, I wore a gold map of Palestine with a Palestinian flag on it that Sausan gave me, and I wore it on the same chain as a Star of David, which at that time meant for me that I'm Jewish and I'm not ashamed of it or embarrassed of it. And frequently people would reach out, pick them up and go, what is this? Are you Israeli? And I said, no, I'm not Israeli and I don't support Israel, but I'm Jewish. And they were completely amazed. Really? Wow, that's amazing. And immediately had absolutely no problem with me whatsoever. Now, I would never do that today because Israel has fully taken that symbol of the Star of David away from Judaism and Jewish identity and made it a symbol of violence and dispossession. But at that time, it felt, I don't know, kind of exciting to me to wear them on the same chain and to do it in the Arab world and kind of break open conversations that might not otherwise have happened.
And how are you treated as a Jewish person in the Arab world in general?
Well, I don't like run around with Jew on my forehead. And I think because of my name and my look, I think people assume that I am whatever I am. If I'm in Egypt, they assume I'm Egyptian. If I'm in Palestine, they assume I'm Palestinian. In Sudan, they did not assume I was Sudanese, however. And I was there at a very violent, scary time. So that was different. In general, I always felt extremely comfortable as a Jew everywhere I went in the Arab world. I felt much safer than I do in the United States as a woman, hands down, no question. And that includes being in Syria and being in Gaza. I just never had a problem.
And you were in the Middle East, if I'm not mistaken. I don't like using Middle East, colonial term or phrase. Let's call Levant, maybe. We'll play it safe. Sabra and Shatila, you were there, I'm assuming, when that occurred. Can you talk about how that impacted you?
I was not there. I was in London. It was on that European backpacking trip that Sabra and Shatila happened. It was absolutely one of the biggest moments of my life. I remember completely being glued to the news coverage of it in a way that since I have been at key moments like during the invasion of Iraq and every time Gaza's attacked, etc., that experience of being completely glued to the news, horrified with every molecule of my being and feeling like this is a Holocaust and this is wrong, and fury and fear and grief. It was horrific. And I thought at the time as a young person that maybe it was the worst thing that I'd ever see. And it turned out to be not.
Yeah, not even close, right?
Not even close.
Yeah. So did that inspire, is that one of the reasons you got inspired to learn more or to roll up your sleeves and really educate yourself on the situation altogether?
Yeah, definitely.
And when you went to Jerusalem for the first time, this is a question I like to ask everyone. What was your first feeling being there?
Oh, man. I don't remember. What was my first feeling being in Jerusalem? Jerusalem has so many feelings for me to dig back to the first one. I'm guessing that it was probably confusion and overwhelm. It is a beautiful, beautiful city. It's so old, and you feel the oldness and the history and the weight of it and the beauty of it all at once. Jerusalem is such a special place, but I don't think I can pick out the very first. I can pick out a million lovely stories that for me illustrate how special Jerusalem is. Do you want to know one?
Yes, please.
Okay. So one thing I remember is going down Salahuddin Street. I was looking for a particular store. So I asked somebody, where is this store? And he told me, walk down there. And when you pass the watermelons, it's on your right. So I walked and walked and walked and walked and walked and walked. And I got all the way to the Damascus Gate. And I didn't see what he was talking about. So I went back looking for the watermelons, couldn't find them, went all the way back to the guy. And I said, I walked and walked and walked and all the way to Damascus Gate, and I don't see any watermelons. How do I find the store if behind the watermelons? And he goes, it's not watermelon season. Like, his reference point was, this is where the watermelons are when there are watermelons. So I'm supposed to know that. I'm supposed to know when there are watermelons, that's where they are.
How dare you not know that?
Well, yeah, there is this assumption, right? And just to make a reference to a physical location that is there at a different time, I just found that fascinating and lovely and gives some insight, I think, into the cultural differences. Another story that I love to tell is being in a coffee shop. I don't know if you've been there or how recently, but there's a coffee shop in Sheikh Jarrah called, or it was there, called Galleria. And I was in Galleria and this waitress kept passing by and I was like, oh, she looks so familiar. Wow, she looks so familiar. I think I must know her. And then she came and she took my order and I said, you know, you look so familiar. You must be Muna's sister. And she goes, I am. And you must be Jassie's mother. Because you know people. And people are parts of families. And that also was really beautiful and kind of an insight into the culture, how both of us knew people who we knew.
Yeah. So talk about meeting your husband too, because marrying a Palestinian and meeting the Palestinian in Palestine, usually most of them meet throughout the diaspora, whether in the US or Europe or whatever it may be, but you met in Palestine, which is intriguing to many people. Can you describe those dynamics and how that came about?
Sure. Between my 2 years of study abroad, the university, because this is a UCLA program, the university sent me to Haifa University for 3 weeks of Hebrew language study. My husband, who's a Palestinian citizen of Israel, was in his senior year. And at that time, inflation in Israel was completely insane. Unlike the Israelis who completed the military and then got scholarships, the Palestinians would have to work all summer so that by the end of the summer, there'd be a little bit of value left to their earnings so they could pay their tuition. So he was at the dormitory. When I was at the dormitory, I had broken a radio that I'd taken with me all over the Levant. I almost said Middle East, but the Levant. And his cousin knew how to fix radios. So his cousin took my radio and told me to pick it up the next day in his dorm room. When I picked it up, that's when I met my husband. They invited me to dinner and he was kind of cute. Yeah.
Just kind of. Yeah.
It's not the story that people expect. It's like a big political decision that you make, and it's just not that. I don't know anyone who marries for politics, and I don't know if they then stay together for 40 years. It's just pretty much like any two people. You think they're cute. That's pretty much it.
Yeah, no, for sure. But I think that the dynamic of meeting somebody again in Palestine, and many people think that there's no way the Palestinians and the Jewish community would talk or cross paths. At least that's what's in the media many times.
Hey, well, this was really in the old days. First of all, there was no wall and there were no checkpoints. So Israelis, which I am not, but Israelis from all over what's now inside the Green Line would go anywhere they wanted all the time. If you were in Ramallah, the restaurants and cafes were full of Israelis. In Nablus, they were full of Israelis. I remember getting on a bus and going to Gaza. You just got on a bus, you went to Gaza for the day, and then you went back. So things were different in that sense. There was a lot more interaction and exchange, but it was not equal and it was not peaceful. There was still occupation. There was definitely oppression and dispossession in every way, but there was more mixing.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk about your experience with the first Intifada, because I believe you created this program. I hope I get it right. Cambridge, Ramallah, El Bira, which is where I'm from, Sister City Project in Massachusetts. First, the experience and what you remember of the first Intifada and why this sort of motivated you to do this project.
I'm trying to remember if I started that project. I do start a lot of projects. I actually don't remember if I started it or if I joined it after it had started or some mix of the two. It was a wonderful, wonderful campaign. At the time, the PLO was illegal and there were no relations and no communication. Palestinians were demonized even more and dehumanized even more than they are today. So we decided just to have our own foreign policy. We're just going to directly make relationships between these two cities. The idea of sister cities in general was very big then. A lot of sister city relationships between US and Salvadoran cities, because this was at the time of the Central America War. So Salvador, Nicaragua, there was just a lot of grassroots people-to-people initiatives. We didn't go that route. We didn't ask the city of Cambridge to declare a sister city because, first of all, we would have lost. And second of all, we didn't want to grant them that power, if you know what I mean. We wanted to make a statement that we can create our own foreign policy as citizens. It was a wonderful program. I learned a lot. I met wonderful people. And twice I led delegations from Cambridge and the surrounding area to the West Bank. And that was during the first Intifada. I got to be there for quite a while. It was fascinating. It was frightening. It was loving. It was inspirational. All of those things. The things that young people read now about the first Intifada, I think, are all true. I remember going to a doctor's office in his home because, you couldn't move around. Everything was under curfew. And he just set up in his home. And whenever the curfew lifted or people felt like they could sneak through alleys or between houses, they would show up to his home. And that was at that time normal. Similarly, teachers, they stayed at home and the students came to them and their learning happened even though the schools were closed. All of that was true and it was beautiful. It was also scary and frightening. I mean, on several occasions, I would be walking through Ramallah and I would see Israeli soldiers walking with young men at gunpoint. You don't know if they're going to kill them or arrest them. And you don't know, what am I supposed to do? Do I intervene? Do I not intervene? Not only what's safest for me, but what is safest for those young men. You don't want to agitate people with guns. It was intense. And it was just another one of those life-changing experiences that I've had the pleasure to have over the course of my involvement with Palestinians. Yeah.
This may be difficult to answer, but do you remember the first time you witnessed a young man or a young boy walking down an aisle or whatever it may be with a gun behind them? Do you remember that visceral feeling that you had?
I really do. I remember the feeling. It was nighttime and there were, mulathamin, they cover their heads and their faces. And whenever they were going through the city, pretty much know they're doing something political. They're engaging with soldiers. They're not running away from soldiers. So there were several of them on their knees on the side of the road, and the soldiers were there with guns. And I was with a Palestinian girlfriend, colleague from the Sister City campaign. And I said, what do we do? And she said, you just keep walking. And that feeling of not being able to do what felt moral and right to me at the time kind of haunts me. And it has happened many times when I've not been able to do the thing that I believed was right or moral.
But most people at that very moment would have said, you know what, this is not for me. I'm going to pack up my stuff and I'm going to go back to Pasadena, California and not worry or witness this anymore. What gave you the courage to stay and to continue to live in that environment?
That particular moment didn't feel like my most courageous moment, but I think the reason why I stay is because it's my fight now. You don't walk away from who you are. And I don't mean I am Palestinian. I mean, I have a stake in this fight as a human being, as a Jew, and as the mother of Palestinian children. I'm white, so I grew up knowing about racism and being an anti-racist as far as I knew how to be. But once I became the mother of Palestinians, that was a whole new understanding of what racism is. It becomes very personal when your own children are demeaned or threatened because of who they are.
So you said that wasn't your most courageous moment. May I ask what was?
No. God, I don't know. I don't see myself as courageous. I would love not to do anything I do. In some ways, maybe starting this campaign, not alone, with others, to drop the ADL from schools, that has felt a little bit frightening in the environment we're in right now, knowing that the Anti-Defamation League is a very big and very powerful bear. To poke it with a pointy stick has felt a little bit more courageous than some other things I've done. Maybe it's this moment. I really don't remember. I don't think a lot maybe about what may have happened in the past, because I think of it like, we're going up a mountain and you just keep going up. You don't keep going back.
Absolutely. And I want to talk about the ADL piece, but if you don't mind, first talk about the Dahlia Association, I believe it's called. And what year was that created? And could you educate the audience as to what the goal of that association was?
Yeah, and it still exists. It's very big and does a lot of work. I'm not affiliated anymore, but I'm pleased that it has survived all these years. After 9/11, the racism in our town and in Massachusetts and in the country became really unbearable as the mother of Palestinian Muslims. And we decided to raise our daughters in Palestine. So in 2004, we moved and spent many years in Jerusalem and then many years in Elbira, actually. Almost immediately when I arrived in Palestine, I became aware of this irritating distortion. An organization would call me, one of the civil society groups like the Hasan Center or something. They'd call me and they'd say, would you come and do a needs assessment for us? And I'd say, sure, I'd love to do that. I did that kind of work when I was in the United States, and I was pleased to have something to do that was meaningful. And so I'd go off and do this job and find out that I was getting paid ridiculous amounts of money compared to the local people. Like, I could make $500 a day, and a teacher didn't even make $500 a month. So wow. I was like, what is happening here? Then I found out that 90% of the time, the work that I did, they threw it away because it was in English. So I'm like, why are you hiring me and paying me $500 a day to write something in English that you throw away? And they said, because the donor wants it. There was a certain amount of money that they had to earmark for waste in order to satisfy donor requirements that were often at odds with the needs and priorities of the local people. So that dynamic was not something I wanted to be part of. And I just began speaking with people, everyone. I just would call up the executive director of an organization and say, I'd like to come and talk to you about dependence on international aid. And they always said yes. I met lots of people and I learned lots of things. And I ended up writing up a document, which I then presented at a conference in Japan and then raised money for to create a community foundation. The Dahlia, which is Palestine's first and I think only community foundation, was established to reduce dependence on international aid by mobilizing resources that Palestinians control themselves. And then over the period of time where we innovated and piloted and grew, I think, very new kinds of participatory control over resources, we developed the concept of self-determination in development. Self-determination is usually thought of in a national context, and development is usually thought of as being apolitical. And we wanted to bring them together and really promote the idea that just because you're poor and you're occupied and you don't have access to your resources and you're oppressed does not mean that someone in Washington or Belgium or Oslo should be making the decisions over what workshops, what professional development, what training communities get. It's just another layer of occupation, first by Israel, then by the donors. And I would add by the whole United Nations system, which entrenches the relationship between donors, in quotes, and beneficiaries, in quotes. It entrenches the relationship between givers who have things of value and receivers who don't have anything of value, and trying to turn that on its head.
Yeah. How did you actually accomplish that, though?
Well, I don't know. How much time do you have, Ed? I mean,
You got time.
Our first wonderful grant program was called The Village Decides. And we would raise a certain amount of money, not a lot, like $14,000, $16,000. And we'd choose a village through a process of criteria that we developed over time. We'd call an all village meeting. Everybody's invited. We particularly invited all the associations and clubs. So the youth club, the women's club, the farmers association, the whatever. We invited people at the hair salon. We invited people at the taxi stand to this open community meeting. We asked all the existing organizations in the village to just talk for 5 minutes and take questions for 5 minutes about what they do. And that was really unusual. Usually the organizations were not very transparent and not accountable beyond their own members, certainly not accountable to the whole village. So some decided not to participate, but most did. They would talk about their organization and what they did. We're a cultural center. We teach Debka. We're a women's group. We work on tathrees or whatever it is. And then they'd answer questions from the community. And the community would say, why did you stop teaching flute? You used to have flute lessons at your club, and now you don't do that anymore. Why don't you do flute anymore? Whatever questions people had. And then the community got to vote. Which are the 4 organizations that they want to invest in? And then we divided the amount of money by the number of people in the room. So each person would control, maybe $252 or $304, whatever the number turned out to be. And they got to allocate that money across the 4 organizations. And what was different about that was, first of all, they were deciding who to fund. It was based on their own priority. We, as Dali Association, oversaw the process to make sure that it was transparent and accountable. But the decisions were made completely by the community. It's their life. It's their existence. They should be deciding how development resources are used on their own behalf. And then after that, the groups that were chosen would develop projects about how they wanted to use those resources. And that turned out to be a key difference between Dahlia and all the other organizations that handed out funds. We were never a donor because the funds didn't belong to us. They were in trust for the people that they were intended for from the beginning. We weren't being benevolent and giving away our resources. We were facilitating self-funding by the Palestinian community, of the Palestinian community. So for them to have the money before they developed the project was important, because when you say to people, give us a project and we're going to choose from among the projects, then they're incented to give you a project they think you're going to fund. It's a distortion. I say to myself, oh, I'm going to apply to you for funding. I think you're going to fund journalism because you do this kind of podcasting. So I'm going to put together a youth journalism project because I think you're going to fund it, even if that's not my priority, right? So in order to take those distortions out, we just systematically continued to pilot and refine ways of self-funding that would remove those distortions. And I loved it. It's one of the projects I'm most proud of in my whole life.
It's a powerful project. And I want to ask, When you're under oppression and essentially under constant abuse, people may feel the sense of not knowing that they have a choice, or basically having choices is taken away from them completely. Here, you're saying, no, we're going to give you a choice, or we're going to create a path in which you have your own choices. What was the response from the community? How did they react initially?
We had all kinds of responses. There were people who refused to participate because they didn't trust the process, and we needed to win and earn their trust. And then there were people that tried to capture the process. I remember one village, you know how they had to choose 4 organizations? It turned out the organization that got the second amount of money were all the wives of the people who had gotten the most amount of money. And like, I later came to understand that the men would vote for themselves, but then they'd vote for their wives. And then the women's organization, the women's association, would kind of be directed by their husbands about what their project should be. And it was a way of not very honestly taking more money, perhaps, than they might have been entitled to. But over the course of our working with them, the women came to understand that it was their own vote. It was their vote, how they used it. And they would ask multiple times to me and my colleague, they would say, we can do anything we want. And we'd say, yeah. And then they'd say, well, do we need to do this other thing? Which was the thing their husbands wanted them to do. We'd say, you can do anything you want. And they'd say, could we do this? We'd go, yeah, you can do that. And by the end of the project, they decided to register as a separate organization from their husbands because they'd had that experience. And I'm not saying that Palestinian men control Palestinian women. That's not what I'm trying to say. I don't want to play into that stereotype. It's inaccurate. And I think the story actually shows how inaccurate it is. When you don't have an administrative process that undermines self-determination, then people will constructively and responsibly pursue their own priorities. So that is a different kind of reaction. We had all different kinds of reactions, but my favorite one was we went to visit a village we had left maybe a year prior just to find out how they were doing. And we asked them, like, was there any lasting impact from our having worked with you? And they said, oh yeah, after you left, whenever donors would come in here, we would say, here's what we need. Are you going to fund it or not? So
wow.
Yeah, they just were like, yeah, we're not going to work with you if you're not funding our priorities. I think they still did often. It's still a very corrupt and bad system, but to be inspiring those kinds of self-determination and kind of uplifting liberatory attitudes and actions, I think is exciting to be part of.
It is. It is. And then you went on to create what's called Aid Watch, which was aid accountability as a form of activism. And I understand it may not be around now, but can you walk through the motivation of creating that?
I created Aid Watch Palestine with a Palestinian in Gaza after the 2014 attack, because what became clear immediately, even while Israel was still attacking, was that the humanitarian response to the attack would be as devastating to Gaza as the attack itself. I know that's a strong thing to say and kind of doesn't make sense right now while we're in the middle of an actual genocide. But the truth is that after every Israeli escalation, the international organizations get stronger and the Palestinian organizations get weaker. And in order to try to reverse or halt that dynamic, my colleague and I thought to really frame the issue of dependence on international aid as an issue of another layer of occupation by the United Nations and its organizations and the organizations that work within that system, so that Palestinians could be more knowledgeable about the actors and the interests that are guiding the decisions in their lives, and then be more empowered to have their own opinions and express their own opinions about it. So we did lots of research about the way that international aid was being distributed, how decisions were being made, how Palestinians were and weren't consulted, and we made that information available to people on the ground. We had a local board in Gaza and local staff in Gaza, and it was an advocacy project. It was a project of bringing the whole aid system into the awareness of the actors that are fighting for Palestinian liberation.
And I imagine a lot of pushback, a lot of politics, a lot of individuals attacking the whole idea.
No.
No?
Not really. I think they didn't take us seriously. And it's true that the project didn't last long enough to have the impact it ultimately could have had, but it did have a lot of impact. Having a project got us into the offices of the representatives of many international governments, where we could just sit face to face with the head of office of a European country and say, for example, this is getting in the weeds a bit, but the Gaza reconstruction mechanism, which was the arrangement between Israel, the PA, and the UN to allow or not allow things in through the crossings into Gaza, that mechanism was a violation of international law, because instead of Israel as the occupying power being responsible for getting things in and out, with the UN overseeing that and holding Israel accountable to international law, Israel became the monitor who held the UN accountable. So just being on the ground with the right analysis, with relationships with the right actors, to be able to name that dynamic as happening and put it out in the world, but more importantly, to make sure Palestinians understood what was happening, that I think was really worth doing. And again, something I was proud to have done, and I'm sorry and sad that it has not withstood time.
You mentioned post 9/11, you made the decision to move back to Palestine to give your kids that sort of Palestinian experience, a huge part of their identity, obviously. And I hope I get this quote right, but I believe it was your daughter who said, "Mommy, why do you make me Arab when you don't have to be?" How did you respond to that, and how did that feel?
Oh, it felt horrible. And we went almost immediately, me and my daughter, my oldest daughter, to the Social Security office and added Murad onto my name. I didn't used to use my married name at all, and I added it on because I wanted her to know that we are the same, me and her. And that maybe also was a turning point in choosing to be part of the Palestinian community, choosing to accept that whatever happens to my daughters and other people I love, my in-laws I love dearly, is also happening to me. It was also the time and the moment where I became aware that she was being exposed to racism that I wasn't even conscious of. I think she was maybe 8 or younger to come up with something like that. What was she hearing? And where was she hearing it? That was pretty frightening.
Yeah. And when you finally moved to Palestine, how did your kids adapt? One thing that you mentioned is the inequalities that the Palestinians face was very clear. You even mentioned the garage dump underscored the inequalities, right? As an example. How did they adapt, and how did you adapt as well as a mother? Because now you're in a completely different environment. And for all intents and purposes, they're always at risk.
Yes, but different risk than in the United States. I would never have left my children in the park alone here where I live in Massachusetts. That would have been dangerous, but I could totally let the kids go to the park all day long in Palestine. And if they ever got lost, which they did sometimes, they followed my direction. You walk up to any auntie and you say, "Auntie, I'm lost. Can you help me get home?" And the auntie, whoever they are, will help my child get home. That's a kind of safety I never experienced here. So I kind of leaned into that and felt overall very good about choosing to raise the girls there. And they would say the same thing That being said, each one of my daughters had her first interrogation around the age of 13. And for each of them, under very different circumstances, it was a dramatic and important experience for them. That's not something that you want for your child. So there was that too. And there was going through checkpoints with machine guns pointed at your head. There were times that we got stuck in traffic where there was tear gas, or, a little boy on that side of my car throwing a stone over my car at that army Jeep. Right. And I am stuck and I've got the kids in the car. So there was that too.
Have they reflected on that experience with you? Have they said, thank you, Mom, for allowing us to live there and really realize our identity as Palestinians?
They say they can't imagine anything else. They can't imagine not growing up there, and they can't imagine not being who they are with that experience. So absolutely. And at this moment, none of them are living there.
Got it. Yeah.
It's not easy.
Yeah. Did they follow in their mother's footsteps as a writer and as an activist, may I ask?
I think they're all active in their own ways. They're all very artistic, and they're all just lovely, amazing people. But nobody's really writing a lot quite yet. Of course, I didn't write when I was that young either. The first book I wrote, Ida in the Middle, I wrote while in Palestine, and I wrote it for my own daughters, really. I didn't know how to write a book, and I just was trying to see, can I do it? Can I figure it out? I never studied writing or journalism or creative writing or anything. I just wanted to see if I could do it, and then I did it.
You did say something in your blog, or on your blog rather, my characters need me, their problems implicate me. Telling their stories is both a duty and an honor. Do you remember that? And what are those characters?
When I'm writing fiction, which it's been a while, I do have a whole other book. It's called Hanini Women, but it's not published yet. When I am writing a book, the characters are really very present. I almost feel like you're channeling somebody. Somebody's like sitting right there and they're telling me, that's not what I said. And I'm like, okay, let me change it. I don't know. I've heard other writers say that happens sometimes. That doesn't happen when I'm writing nonfiction, but when I'm writing fiction, it is kind of a, spiritual experience it could be several months or even several years, where the characters feel very real, and I do feel obligated to represent them the way they're telling me to represent them.
Yeah. And talk about Ida in the Middle. I mentioned to you before we started recording that I've ordered the book for my kids. Can you talk about that story and the importance of writing that?
So I wrote Ida in the Middle for my own daughters. They were reading Harry Potter and Warriors and the Percy Jackson series. They were all very exciting books, and they were big readers, which I was proud of, but also maybe a little jealous of. They spent more time with their books, I think, than they did with me sometimes. So I wrote the book for them. And because I was living in Jerusalem at the time, and I had 3 children, and because I consider myself an insider-outsider, what I mean by that is there are things that are so normal to Palestinians that they don't notice them. I do, because I'm not a Palestinian. And that gives me a perspective. It also takes away a lot of perspective. There's a million things that I see that I don't understand, or I misunderstand, or I could never understand because I'm not Palestinian. So I wrote the book for them. It brings in lots of specific situations that we faced as a family, or that were faced by people that we knew and loved. So it's not autobiography or a memoir in any way. It's a fiction story about a Palestinian American girl, and it has some culturally appropriate magic in it. And all of the situations are real situations. After I wrote it, and for many years I couldn't get it published, I published 2 other books, in fact, before Ida in the Middle was published. I realized that it could be more than just entertainment for my own kids. It could be, hopefully, perhaps a kind of a window that non-Palestinians could look through to learn something about Palestinians, and that for Palestinians, it could be a mirror where they could look and see themselves in books when they usually don't. There just aren't enough books about Palestinians or representing Palestinians and representing Palestinians in a positive and complex way.
So for the audience, can we cheat a little bit and tell them what that magic was all about in the book?
Sure. Ida is stress eating to procrastinate. She doesn't want to write to work on this intimidating school project. She has to present her life's passion in front of the whole school, and that's absolutely mortifying to her. So she's stress eating from a jar of olives, one of those plastic jars with the yellow tops that anyone who's been in Palestine is familiar with. And she's eating from this jar of olives, and they transport her to the life she would have had in Palestine if her parents had never moved to the United States in the first place. And this was maybe a lazy device, I'm not sure, that I was trying to use so that I wouldn't have her travel. I didn't want her to physically travel to Palestine because I'm kind of sick of that storyline where people go to Palestine and then they open their eyes and they get religion or whatever. I wanted to engage a question that I think a lot of kids ask, like, what if I lived in Gaza? What if I grew up over there? What if my parents didn't speak English as a first language? What if? And that's what I wanted to get at with the magic olives. That being said, my mother-in-law's olives, because, you know, every family and probably every woman has her own specific recipe for the mix of, you know, salt, herbs, and peppers that she puts in the olives when they're cured. My mother-in-law's olives are actually magic, and they will actually transport you to her kitchen.
I believe that. I absolutely believe that. And speaking about olives, talk about, I mean, sort of an olive tree here, possibly, right? Rest in My Shade, a poem about roots, which is a metaphor of an uprooted tree. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so it is a story told by an olive tree. She narrates her own story of being uprooted. And the book is a poetic story, a short number of words with a lot of Palestinian art by Palestinians from all over the world around the theme of olive trees. And it's a book around the theme of olive trees. Dana Masad, who's a very prominent children's book writer now. I think she wasn't even published then, but she came and gave a writer's workshop. I met Dana in that workshop. We had to do a writing prompt, and Dana wrote her prompt about Iraq, like from the perspective of Iraq. And I was like completely blown away. I was like, how did she think of that? Like to do it from the perspective of Iraq. And as we became friends and I fell in love with her, which I am to this day, I came to appreciate how she sees life in everything. Like everything is alive and everything has a perspective and everything has a life force in a way. I don't think that's the word she would use, but we decided to write the story from the perspective of the tree and to explore that. And that's what we did. I love that book. It is now out of print from the publisher, but it is available through the Palestine Museum US in Connecticut. That's the only place where there are copies left, and I have some.
How do we get that back onto a platform where people can actually purchase it again? Who do we have to lobby?
I mean, I don't know. It's out of print. I don't know. It's something to think about, I guess.
I think Interlink Books is the only Palestinian publisher in the US.
And
so maybe we should...
they published it originally. They're the original publisher. So we'll see what will happen with that.
There we go.
Thanks for your interest.
Yeah, of course. And then one of my favorites is I Found Myself in Palestine, Stories of Love and Renewal from Around the Globe. I thought it was powerful. Actually, I read this in part. Steve Sosby was our second interview on the podcast, and his wife contributed to this as well.
Yes.
Can you talk about the motivation behind it and the inspiration?
Sure. Being a non-Palestinian in Palestine, unique experience, and yet somehow not. Like when you actually live in Palestine, you realize there's a lot of other foreigners living there, and that while our experiences are all very different, because we're all different and we're in different situations. The book was originally called Ajnabi, which means foreigner, and then the title got changed to I Found Myself in Palestine. But the reason why the Ajnabi idea was so interesting to me was I feel like in the United States, when you're a foreigner, it's a category that puts you outside of the community. Like, here's the community, and then you are a foreigner outside of the community. But I feel like being Ajnabiya or being a foreigner in Palestine is a category that's inside the community. I feel like that is one of the categories in the community. And that made me feel very welcome and a lot of sense of belonging, but also a sense of you're never going to be Palestinian, but you belong in this specific role. And there's something bittersweet to me about it. Actually, I should just say there's something bitter to me about it. You know, being a member of a family for 40 years and really never being able to express myself fully the way I want to. I love my in-laws. I love them. And, you know, they love me. I know they love me. But because of language and because of culture, I don't think that we ever fully understand one another. And that's somehow, I don't know, sad. I think I brought a lot of sadness to that book when I was conceptualizing it. And as I reached out to different people like Steve Sotheby and Zaina and others to write chapters, that others also shared that. They shared a sense of how it feels to not fully belong in Palestine, but also to no longer belong to their cultures of origin. Because once you know what's happening in Palestine, you're somehow different from everybody at home too. I don't know, maybe you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I do. And in relation to this, I think you stated that I remind myself that my own experiences and opinions are not more correct or valuable than Palestinians, but they are just as legitimate.
Mm.
And I felt when I read that you were giving yourself permission to feel and express your feelings of what you were going through as a non-Palestinian in a Palestinian world.
Yeah, well, I always have to struggle with that, and there's no resolution. Like, why am I a non-Palestinian writing books about Palestine? I don't even believe in that. I'm like literally morally and politically opposed to that. So how do I justify it? And I'm not trying to justify it. I'm struggling with the reality of it, that I am writing about my own life. This is my life. My life is being a non-Palestinian in Palestine and in the Palestinian community. So I feel like if I stay strongly in my positionality, then I can justify it. But even when I justify it, I can't ever fully sit with it correctly. I can give you 100 reasons why it's okay, why I write about what I do. And Palestinians also tell me that they appreciate and want me to do what I'm doing. But I always will have that doubt. And I always say to people, I appreciate if you buy my books. I hope they are a gateway into Palestinian books written by Palestinians, because those are the most important. And nobody should read one book anyway.
And again, I want to encourage our audience too to check out your blog. Can I plug your blog for you? Is that okay?
And you may.
NoraLesterMurad.com, The View from My Window in Palestine. Just briefly, if you don't mind, what motivated you to start blogging?
I think feeling like I wanted to be sure my reality was real. Everything was so surreal. I just wanted to name it and to tell people that, hey, people at home in the United States, what you've heard and what you think about Palestinians, Palestine is not true. And I'm going to show you from my point of view. I can't show you from Palestinians' point of view. I can show you from my point of view as someone who's living here. I can show you and tell you what I'm seeing and going through.
And how active are you on the blog?
Not as active anymore. Now I publish articles and then I post them on the blog. But that kind of blogging I used to do was very much out of the day-to-day life of living in Palestine. Now I live in Massachusetts. It's different. So I don't blog that way anymore, but I do a lot of writing and then posting there. I try to keep it up to date.
Well, it makes sense to me. You don't have time to blog, given that you're working on dropping the ADL from schools, which is such a phenomenal project. If you wouldn't mind educating our audience about that initiative.
Sure. So the Anti-Defamation League is one of the most powerful and most problematic Jewish Zionist organizations in the United States. And they're problematic for many reasons, many of which were exposed by a 2020 campaign called Drop the ADL, which still exists. It's at droptheadl.org. And that initiative helped progressive organizations to realize that the ADL is not a civil rights organization as it claims to be. It is a conservative and right-wing organization that uses its Jewish identity as a fig leaf for its right-wing politics. And you can see that in the ADL's long history of surveilling and attacking communities of color, not only Palestinian, other Arab American and Muslim American, but other communities of color in the United States. There are very close relationships with police, including using those relationships, leveraging them to use state repression against Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims. So they did a great job bringing that out to the awareness of progressive organizations. But over time, teachers and educators who are interacting with the ADL in schools on a daily basis, either curricula or professional development or as consultants in various ways, the materials and the framing of the Drop the ADL campaign wasn't exactly a perfect fit for educators. So we then iterated a second iteration or an additional iteration, which is Drop the ADL from schools. Our website links to Drop the ADL, there's links to ours. So it doesn't matter where you start, you can get everywhere. And the role the ADL plays in schools is not very well known, and the extent to which it is damaging to all children's education isn't very well known. This is a marathon. It is not a sprint of raising awareness about what the ADL is, about the damage they're causing, and helping educators to get rid of the ADL, remove it from the schools. It's not an educational organization. It is a Israel advocacy political organization with interests that dovetail and synergize with other right-wing Zionist organizations. It shouldn't be providing curriculum or professional development or advice to schools at all.
And how do we support this initiative?
Well, it kind of depends on who you are. If you are a teacher, if you are a parent of a student, if you are an activist in a place that cares about education, public or private, find out what role the ADL is playing in your school or district. K-12 education is so decentralized that what might be happening in one school could be completely different. You might have a school where the ADL is deeply entrenched next to a school where the ADL is not visible at all. It could happen in a district where all schools are participating in the No Place for Hate program, or it could be in a district in a state where the state is promoting ADL materials on a statewide level. So just find out what's happening that affects you, find other people who care about it, and depending on whether you are parents or teachers or students, you'll have different paths to take to learn and then to try to push back on the ADL. Because it's so variable, depending on who you are and what's happening, we developed advocacy materials on our website that are very, let's say, editable and modifiable. You can download the materials, the advice documents, the sample letters. You can change them to focus on anything that you want to focus on. And you can also be in touch with us either as an organizational or individual signatory to our open letter to educators, which says the ADL is not a social justice partner. You can also join our educators chat to be in communication with other educators who are also learning about what the ADL is doing and speaking out against it. You can also join our accountability group or our core team. There's so many ways to get involved. You can participate in local actions. You can make videos. You can do social media. At the end of the day, what we're trying to do is just discredit them. Just discredit them. They are not who they say they are. Their impact is harmful on all kids. And they are so entrenched. They're large. They have a lot of money. They have a lot of staff. They have a lot of history. So it's not an easy task, but it's important. And a lot of people realize that and are stepping forward. Just 2 weeks ago, actually, on March 3rd, a former ADL education director published an op-ed in the New York Daily News saying that she had been an ADL education director and quit because she realized that it was a political organization. It was not protecting Jews, which is a very worthwhile thing to do, to fight against anti-Semitism. It wasn't doing that. It was protecting Israel. And it was actually throwing Jews under the bus if those Jews didn't share their Zionist political beliefs. So having insiders whistleblow or these tell-all exposés, the analysis that folks like Jewish Currents, The Intercept, and I recently have done to show how the ADL statistics are distorted and politicized, inaccurate, and methodologically flawed, even separate from the politics. It's just like bad research. It's bad statistics. All of these things over time, I hope, will help anyone who's anti-racist to see that you can't fight racism against Jews by promoting racism against Palestinians. It doesn't work that way. If you are anti-racist, you believe in the dignity, security, and rights of all people, and you can't sacrifice one for another.
Has the ADL responded to you at all in any way?
The ADL is responding all the time. Is it to us? I don't know. I mean, of course, yes, I'm doxxed, I'm Canary Mission, all that stuff. Who knows what the origins of all those things are? You don't know. Who cares? What the ADL is doing in their response to criticism is further aligning with the Trump right wing to leverage a state power against Palestinians and people who support Palestinians. That can be through reputational slander, just accusing someone of anti-Semitism. All of a sudden, their job is at risk, right? We had the ADL recently in December accuse an educational association here in Massachusetts called MassQ, the Massachusetts Computer Using Educators, of anti-Semitism because of a panel on equity at their conference, at the annual conference. So the ADL accuses them of anti-Semitism. The co-sponsor of the conference, the Massachusetts Association of School Superintendents, pulls out of MassQ. MassQ fires their executive director and closes down. They closed a state educational organization because of an accusation by the ADL. This isn't an accusation where there's an investigation and it's proven true or false. No, the accusation itself caused a statewide educator organization to close down. And the science and technology teachers in this state were furious. They're like, how do you close this is where we get our continuing education units. This is where we stay abreast of developments in our field of science and technology. So that is frightening. As it happens, MassQ, which is a state affiliate of the National Science and Technology Association for Teachers, has reopened with a new director and a new board. What the ADL's role in that was, I don't know. But the fact that the ADL can have that kind of effect in an educational association is frightening to me. They also did that at the National Association of Independent Schools, at their People of Color Conference, where Suzanne Barakat and Ruha Benjamin spoke. The ADL accused them of anti-Semitism. They immediately caved in and apologized, although there was no anti-Semitism. because as we know, talking about apartheid, colonization, and genocide is not anti-Semitic. It is, in fact, what education is. That's what education is. Talking about what's happening, what isn't happening, etc. So those kinds of reputational slander is one kind of a violence. They also engage in lawfare, where they either sue or file false, I call them false. They file Title VI complaints alleging that Jewish students are experiencing a hostile environment in schools, which is a violation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, by allowing criticism of Israel. So we get into really thorny issues, like when is a student uncomfortable and when are they unsafe? When does a Jewish student for whom Israel is central to their identity, when are they, targeted because of criticism of Israel? And when is that free political speech? These are all really important issues. We need to talk about them. We need to work them out. We do not want them to be silenced or censored. And we certainly do not want people deported without due process because of who they are or what they believe. And the ADL is involved in those very fascistic activities that we're seeing right now and must be held accountable for what they're doing. And if they're going to advocate for the deportation of people without due process, they certainly should not be in my child's school.
And I'm sure you're reading Trump's intention of closing the Department of Education. What's the impact going to be on the students as it pertains to Palestine?
I don't know. I don't know what's happening right now. I'm confused and overwhelmed and sad and angry and scared to absolute death. I don't know what's going to happen. I think in the long run, some people will realize the convergence of the right-wing Zionist agenda with the Republican Christian nationalist agenda. And some good will come out of that and some bad will come out of that. These are hard times. I don't begin to know what's going to happen.
So the idea is to give the states more authority, right? I think that's my understanding. So eliminating the Department of Education altogether and giving that power to the states.
Oh, I don't know.
themselves.
Is that what they say? They always say that, but I think ultimately they want power over everything. It's just about how to do it.
Yeah.
They're not going to give up any power to the states to do what we want to do. They're going to just, let's say, decentralize the implementation, the enforcement of their politics. They'll give it to the state if the state does what they want. But if the state doesn't what they want, they're not going to give it to the state. They'll find a way.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Thank you so much for your time. I do want to leave you with one final question or a quote again. I loved all of your quotes. I probably quoted you more than any other guest, just so you know, because I love so much of what you've written. You said something to the effect of, if you took Palestine away from me, there would be a massive hole. And this was many years ago. I'm curious, do you still feel the same way?
Look, I have spent 2/3 of my life trying to stop horrible things from happening. And I'm so resentful of that. It's not the same as spending 2/3 of my life being a victim of occupation and ethnic cleansing, as Palestinians have been, but I also feel cheated. And I think we should all feel cheated. You and I, instead of talking about Israel and Israeli violence right now, we could be talking about, I don't know, like a movie or a song or something beautiful. We could be talking about children or trees or any number of things. We could go out today and spend the day at a museum. We're not. They took our whole lives, and not just your life and my life, generations of lives of Palestinians and of people who support social justice. I'm so mad about that. So if you took the pain of Palestine away, that would fill a hole. That would not cause a hole. But certainly to not have had the tremendous honor, joy, and pain of having my life bound up with Palestinians, I would be a different person. I don't know who I would be. This is very much who I am.
And with that, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Listen, stay tuned, cause it's time for Sumud.